They thought I was too broken to protect what was mine. That was their first mistake. The night after my husband's memorial, my daughter-in-law stood in my kitchen, her arms folded neatly across her cream sweater, and told me in a voice polished with sympathy that it might be time to consider something smaller, something safer, something more manageable for someone your age. My son Daniel stood beside her, staring at the hardwood floor. Thomas and I had refinished ourselves 22 years ago, and he didn't contradict a single word. I remember the way the house sounded in that moment. Too quiet. The refrigerator humming. The grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. The same clock Thomas wound every Sunday without fail. I had buried my husband of 43 years just 6 days earlier. I was still setting out 2 coffee mugs in the morning before catching myself. Still reaching across the bed at night and finding nothing but cold sheets. Grief is a strange thing. It hollows you out without making a sound. Olivia mistook that hollow for weakness. You shouldn't be alone in a place this big, she continued gently, glancing around at the 3,400 square feet Daniel grew up in. The crown molding Thomas insisted on installing himself. The bay window overlooking the maple tree we planted when Daniel turned 10. We've been looking at some lovely senior communities. They have yoga classes, meal plans, security. Security. As if I had spent my life in danger. I folded Thomas's navy cardigan over the back of a chair and said nothing. Silence unsettles people more than anger ever could. Daniel finally cleared his throat. It's just practical, Mom. Property taxes alone are nearly $9,000 a year. It's a lot. Practical. That word again. Practical is what people say when love becomes inconvenient. I nodded once, slow and deliberate, as though I were considering a minor suggestion about repainting the guest room. Inside, something steadied. Not hardened. Steadied. I had learned over decades of marriage and motherhood that reacting too quickly gives other people control. Listening gives you power. Olivia began speaking about timelines. About listing the house before summer. About easing the transition. She spoke as if I were not standing 5 feet away, as if I had already faded into a polite obligation. I watched her hands move when she talked, manicured nails catching the kitchen. Like Thomas had installed himself last winter. I wondered how long she had been planning this conversation. A week? A month? Perhaps longer. Grief makes people underestimate you. They assume you cannot think clearly. They assume paperwork and legal language blur in your tired eyes. They assume the widow does not remember where documents are kept. I remembered everything. I remembered the afternoon Thomas and I sat at this same kitchen table with our attorney. I remembered the way he squeezed my hand under the table when we signed the final page. This house is your anchor, he had told me later that evening while we measured the backyard for a new fence. No one moves you unless you choose to go. I looked at my son now, at the boy who once built a treehouse in that same yard, and asked me to hold the ladder steady. He would not meet my eyes. Olivia filled the silence again, suggesting tours, brochures, square footage comparisons. I let her talk. I let Daniel shift his weight uncomfortably. I let them believe my quiet meant surrender. When they finally left that evening, their SUV headlights sweeping across the front porch Thomas painted every spring, I locked the door and leaned my forehead briefly against the cool wood. I did not cry. I did not call anyone. I walked down the hallway, past framed photographs of Christmas mornings and college graduations, and into Thomas's study. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk where the important files were kept, exactly where they had always been. They thought I was weak. What they did not understand was that I had spent 43 years building this life brick by brick. And I was not finished yet. The house felt larger the next morning, as if the walls had quietly stepped back from me during the night. Sunlight slipped through the bay window and landed across the dining room table, illuminating the faint scratches Thomas used to complain about every Thanksgiving. I stood in the kitchen holding 2 mugs before remembering again that only one would be used. I poured the coffee anyway, out of habit, and carried both cups to the table. One remained untouched across from me, steam curling upward and fading into the still air. Grief does not arrive loudly every day. Sometimes it settles in like dust, thin and persistent. I sat there for a long time listening to the ticking of the grandfather clock, counting the seconds between each swing of the pendulum. Daniel used to race through this house in socked feet, sliding across these same hardwood floors. Now he walked through it as if it were already a listing brochure. By 9 o'clock my phone vibrated. Olivia had sent a link to a real estate website. 3-bedroom colonial, newly renovated, walking distance to shops. The message read, just an idea. No pressure. I stared at the words no pressure longer than I should have. Pressure rarely announces itself. It disguises itself as concern. I closed the message without replying and carried my coffee into Thomas's study. The room still smelled faintly of his aftershave and old paper. I opened the bottom drawer again, more slowly this time, and lifted the thick file folder bound with a simple brass clip. Deeds. Insurance policies. Statements. Thomas believed in order. He believed that preparation was a form of love. My fingers traced his careful handwriting on the tabs. Whitmore residence. Trust documents. Beneficiary designations. I did not rush. I read each page the way he would have, line by line, lips pressed together in quiet focus. Outside, a delivery truck rolled down the street, and a dog barked somewhere in the distance. The world had not paused simply because mine had shifted. By late morning there was a knock at the door. Daniel stood on the porch holding a cardboard box. He did not call first. He rarely did anymore. Inside the box were brochures, glossy and thick, showing smiling gray-haired couples playing tennis and sipping lemonade beside manicured lawns. He set them on the kitchen counter as if they were harmless magazines. "We just want you to be comfortable, Mom," he said. "This is too much house for one person." His eyes moved across the cabinets, the ceiling, the staircase. He was measuring, not space, value. I wiped the counter slowly with a dishcloth, buying myself time. "This house has been mine for decades," I replied evenly. "It has never been too much for me before." He exhaled, the way he used to when he was a teenager being corrected. "Things are different now. You do not have Dad." That was true. I did not have Thomas. But I still had myself. And I still had the documents. Resting in the study drawer, Daniel began talking about maintenance costs, about lawn care, about how busy he and Olivia were. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I folded the dishcloth neatly and placed it beside the sink. "I will consider everything carefully," I said. Careful consideration sounds cooperative. It is not the same as agreement. Daniel seemed relieved, mistaking patience for compliance. After he left, I gathered the brochures and stacked them in a straight line on the table. Then I carried them into the study and placed them beside the file folder. Preparation is quiet. Strength is often invisible in the beginning. And I had decided that if they wanted to calculate my future, I would begin calculating theirs. 3 days later, I noticed the first real crack in their performance. It was small, almost forgettable, but small things reveal intention. I had just returned from the grocery store with 2 modest paper bags, nothing extravagant, just milk, fresh bread, a carton of blueberries, and the brand of coffee Thomas preferred, even though I was the only one drinking it now. As I stepped into the kitchen, I saw that the lockbox on the hallway closet where we kept important household items had been moved slightly out of place. It was subtle, no more than an inch off center, but Thomas and I had always aligned it carefully against the back wall. Order was a language in this house. I set the groceries down slowly and walked toward it. The combination had been changed. I entered the numbers Thomas used for decades. Our anniversary, followed by Daniel's birth year. The dial refused to turn. I tried again, slower. Nothing. For a moment, I stood there with my hand resting on the cool metal, feeling neither panic nor anger, only clarity. Someone had decided I should not have easy access anymore. That afternoon, Olivia called, her voice bright and efficient. "Daniel mentioned you might be reviewing paperwork," she said casually. "We just thought it would be helpful if we organized some things for you." Organized. Another gentle word. I pictured her manicured fingers adjusting files that did not belong to her. I thanked her for her concern and told her I had everything well in hand. She paused for half a second too long before replying that, of course, she only wanted what was best. When I hung up, I did not confront anyone. Confrontation is loud and often useless. Instead, I returned to Thomas's study and unlocked the small fireproof safe behind the bookshelf, the one no one else knew about, because Thomas had installed it himself on a quiet Saturday afternoon while Daniel was away at college. Inside were certified copies of the deed, the trust agreement, and a letter addressed in Thomas's handwriting to our attorney, Harold Bennett. I ran my fingers over the raised ink of his signature and felt a steadiness settle in my chest. That evening, Daniel stopped by again, unannounced, carrying takeout containers as if generosity could soften intrusion. He moved through the house with quick glances, his eyes scanning surfaces the way a realtor evaluates staging. "Mom," he began carefully, "Olivia and I were thinking it might be wise to consolidate accounts, just to simplify things. You do not need to worry about managing all of it alone." I studied his face, the same blue eyes Thomas once had, now clouded with something I could not name. "I have managed this household for over 40 years, I replied evenly. "I believe I can manage a few statements." He forced a small smile and began opening the containers on the counter. As we ate at the kitchen table, he mentioned that property values in our neighborhood had risen nearly 12% in the last year. He said it like a fact shared in passing, but facts are rarely neutral when money is involved. I listened. I asked mild questions. I let him believe I was absorbing his guidance. After he left, I walked through each room slowly. Touching the banister, Thomas varnished himself, straightening a picture frame, adjusting a lamp. This house was not just square footage and rising market value. It was history. It was intention. And someone had just tried to lock me out of it. They believed I would not notice. They believed grief would blur my awareness. They were wrong. The following morning, I made an appointment with Harold Bennett before I allowed myself to think twice about it. I did not inform Daniel. I did not mention it to Olivia. Some decisions grow stronger in silence. Harold had been our attorney for more than 20 years, a careful man with silver hair and the habit of adjusting his glasses when something interested him. His office sat on Main Street above a bakery that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and warm sugar. Thomas used to joke that legal advice was easier to absorb with the scent of pastries drifting through the floorboards. When I stepped inside, Harold greeted me with a softness that did not feel like pity. "I am sorry for your loss, Margaret," he said, and he meant it. I placed the file folder on his desk and watched his expression shift from sympathy to focus. We reviewed the trust documents slowly, page by page, just as Thomas and I had years ago. The Whitmore residence was not simply in my name. It was protected within a revocable living trust that named me as primary trustee and sole decision-maker unless I voluntarily relinquished authority. No one could alter that without my signature. No one could transfer assets without my consent. Harold confirmed it in calm, precise language. "Has anyone suggested otherwise?" he asked carefully. I chose my words with equal care. "There have been suggestions about simplifying my life, consolidating accounts, preparing for a transition." Harold leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "Simplification is not the same as surrender," he said. "If you feel pressured, that is a separate matter." Pressure. The word landed firmly this time. I asked him about the lockbox in the hallway closet, about access, about whether anyone besides me had legal authority. The answer was clear. They did not. When I left his office, the air felt different. Not lighter, sharper. I drove home past the elementary school where Daniel once waited for me every afternoon with a backpack too large for his shoulders. I remembered holding his hand as we crossed the street, how tightly he used to grip my fingers. Somewhere along the years that grip had loosened. Back at the house, I walked directly to the hallway closet and studied the lockbox again. It no longer represented storage. It represented assumption. That evening Daniel called, his tone casual but probing. "Olivia and I were thinking about meeting with a financial advisor together," he said, "just to make sure everything is aligned." I asked him what needed alignment. There was a brief pause. "Well, just to be proactive. In case anything happens." Anything had already happened. I had buried my husband. I had not buried my judgment. I told him I appreciated the suggestion, and that I already had an appointment scheduled with Harold. Silence followed. A thin, tight silence. "You did not mention that," Daniel said finally. "There are many things I have not mentioned," I replied gently. After we hung up, I stood at the kitchen sink watching the sun set behind the maple tree in the backyard. The branches were still bare from winter, but small buds had begun to form along the tips. Renewal does not announce itself loudly. It begins quietly, almost invisibly. I realized then that this was not only about a house or paperwork. It was about whether I would allow myself to be repositioned without consent. Thomas had trusted me with our life. I intended to honor that trust. And if my son and his wife believed I would drift compliantly toward whatever plan they constructed, they were underestimating the woman who had built this home from its foundation up. 2 days after my meeting with Harold Bennett, Olivia invited me to dinner at their house across town. The invitation sounded warm, almost rehearsed, and I accepted without hesitation. Declining would have signaled resistance. I preferred observation. Their home sat in a newer subdivision with identical driveways and freshly planted trees that had not yet grown tall enough to offer shade. As I stepped inside, the scent of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air. Olivia greeted me with a careful smile and a brief embrace that never fully closed the distance between us. Daniel set the table while glancing at his watch more than once. We ate in their dining room beneath a chandelier that was more decorative than practical. Conversation began harmlessly. Work updates. Traffic complaints. A neighbor who had recently renovated their kitchen. I listened and nodded, contributing just enough to keep the rhythm smooth. Halfway through the meal, Olivia cleared her throat and placed her fork down with deliberate softness. Margaret, she began, Daniel and I have been thinking about how to protect your future. Protect. The word was polished, but it carried weight. She continued, explaining that they had spoken with a financial planner who recommended consolidating oversight of assets for efficiency and tax advantages. Daniel added that it would simply require a durable power of attorney, nothing dramatic, just a precaution. Precaution for what? I asked calmly. In case of emergencies, he replied. In case you are unable to make decisions. I folded my napkin carefully on my lap and looked at my son, truly looked at him. I am fully capable of making decisions today, I said evenly. Of course you are, Olivia responded quickly. This is just forward thinking. I recognize the choreography now. Concern framed as responsibility. Responsibility framed as inevitability. I asked to see the documents. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before retrieving a folder from the kitchen counter. The papers were neatly clipped, already prepared, lines marked with small adhesive tabs where my signature would be required. Efficient. Organized. Confident. I read the first page slowly. The language was broad, granting authority over financial accounts, real estate transactions, and investment decisions. Authority that would become active upon a physician's statement of incapacity. Incapacity can be subjective when convenience is involved. I placed the papers back on the table and met Daniel's eyes. I appreciate your initiative, I said. I will review this with Harold before signing anything. Olivia's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. There is no rush, she replied, though the prepared tabs suggested otherwise. The rest of the dinner passed with careful politeness. When I drove home, the streetlights flickered on one by one along Maple Avenue. The house greeted me in darkness except for the porch light I had left burning. Inside, the air felt steady, familiar. I walked through the living room and paused beside the fireplace Thomas built with his own hands, stone by stone, over one long summer. I imagined his quiet laugh at the idea that I would surrender authority simply because someone requested it gently. I did not feel anger. I felt confirmation. They were not asking for help. They were positioning for control. I placed the unsigned documents on Thomas's desk and opened the safe once more, reviewing the trust language under the soft glow of the desk lamp. Every clause reinforced the same truth. I was not dependent. I was not vulnerable. And I was not required to hand over stewardship of the life we built. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the heating system. In that quiet, my resolve settled completely. If they believed preparation on their part guaranteed compliance on mine, they had misunderstood who they were dealing with. I did not respond to the documents the next day or the day after that. Silence, when used correctly, becomes its own message. Instead, I called Harold again and asked him a different question. What would happen, I asked calmly, if I chose to restructure the trust entirely? There was a brief pause on the line, not of confusion but of recalculation. You have that right, Margaret, he said carefully. As primary trustee, you may amend terms at any time while you are competent. Competent. The word sounded almost ironic now. I scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday. I did not mention it to Daniel. That Sunday afternoon, Daniel arrived without notice again, this time alone. He walked into the living room and glanced at the stack of unsigned power of attorney papers resting untouched on the side table. Have you had time to look them over? He asked. I told him I had reviewed them thoroughly. And he pressed gently. And I have decided not to sign them. The room grew still. Daniel sat down slowly across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Mom, this is not about control. It is about making sure everything is streamlined. You do not need to carry this alone. I looked at my son and saw not a villain, but a man who had convinced himself that efficiency justified intrusion. I have carried this household for decades, I replied evenly. I carried it when you were an infant. I carried it when your father worked 80-hour weeks building his firm. I am not overwhelmed. He exhaled and rubbed his temples. Olivia just worries, he said. Olivia worries about access, I corrected softly. His jaw tightened at that. That is not fair. What is fair, I asked calmly, is respecting the structure your father and I put in place. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood and began pacing slowly across the hardwood floor, the same floor he once slid across in socks as a boy. Property values are rising, Mom. Maintenance costs are increasing. We are trying to be proactive. Proactive can easily become presumptive, I answered. I told him I had consulted Harold again, that I was exploring adjustments to the trust. His pacing stopped. Adjustments, he repeated. Yes, I said. Adjustments that ensure clarity. Daniel's expression shifted, uncertainty replacing confidence. What kind of adjustments? The kind that protect what your father built, I replied. He asked whether that meant changes to inheritance. I held his gaze for a long moment before answering. It means I am evaluating every option available to me. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Daniel eventually left without raising his voice, without slamming a door. Just quiet footsteps down the porch steps and the low hum of his engine fading down Maple Avenue. That evening I sat in Thomas's study again, reviewing the trust language under the lamplight. There were provisions for charitable allocations, educational funds, conditional distributions. Thomas had believed in accountability. He had always said that wealth without character erodes both. I ran my hand across the polished wood of his desk and felt the steadiness return. They had mistaken grief for incapacity. They had mistaken patience for passivity. But now the balance had shifted. I was no longer reacting. I was restructuring. And the difference between those two things is everything. On Tuesday morning, I walked into Harold Bennett's office with a single leather folder tucked beneath my arm and a clarity I had not felt in weeks. The bakery downstairs was already busy, the scent of fresh bread drifting faintly through the hallway. And for a brief moment, I remembered standing there years ago beside Thomas as we finalized the original trust. Back then we were planning for security. Now I was planning for accountability. Harold greeted me with a nod that suggested he understood the gravity without requiring explanation. We sat across from each other at the polished oak conference table, and I laid out my decision plainly. I wanted to amend the trust. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of precision. We reviewed the structure carefully. The Whitmore residence would remain solely under my authority for as long as I chose to live in it. Any future transfer would require my direct instruction in writing. In addition, I instructed Harold to create a charitable foundation in Thomas's name, funded by a significant portion of our investment portfolio. The foundation would support vocational scholarships for young tradesmen, honoring the kind of hands-on work Thomas valued. The remaining assets would be distributed conditionally, contingent upon demonstrated respect for the terms of the trust and the absence of coercive behavior. Harold listened without interruption. When he finally spoke, his voice carried quiet approval. You are not reacting emotionally, he observed. You are reinforcing boundaries. That distinction mattered. By the time I signed the amended documents, my signature felt steadier than it had in years. I did not rush home. I drove slowly through town, past the hardware store where Thomas once bought lumber for our deck, past the park where Daniel learned to ride his bicycle. Memory is powerful, but it does not override judgment. That evening Daniel called again, his tone edged with something less controlled. Olivia mentioned you met with Harold. I confirmed that I had. And he pressed. And I have made adjustments to the trust. Silence followed, longer this time. Adjustments that affect what, exactly? Adjustments that ensure clarity about ownership and intention, I replied. He asked whether the house was still intended to remain in the family. The house is in the family, I answered. I am the family. He did not appreciate that response. I could hear him pacing on the other end of the line, much like he had done in my living room days earlier. Mom, this feels unnecessary. Unnecessary to whom? I asked calmly. He did not answer directly. Instead, he shifted the conversation toward unity, toward keeping things simple, toward avoiding complications. Complications arise when expectations exceed entitlement, I said quietly. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply stated truth. After we ended the call, I stood by the living room window and looked out at the maple tree, its early buds now beginning to show hints of green. Change rarely happens in dramatic bursts. It unfolds incrementally, almost invisibly at first. I understood now that this was not a battle of wills. It was a correction of assumptions. They had assumed I would drift toward whatever arrangement felt convenient to them. They had assumed that loss diminished authority. Instead, loss had sharpened my perspective. The documents were amended. The foundation was established. The structure was fortified. And for the first time since Thomas's funeral, the house felt less like a target and more like what it had always been. Mine. Daniel did not come by for nearly a week after our last conversation, and the silence between us felt deliberate rather than accidental. I spent those days moving through the house with renewed awareness, noticing details I had once taken for granted. The slight creak on the third stair from the bottom. The way afternoon light settled in a perfect rectangle across the living room rug at exactly 3:30. The faint scent of cedar inside Thomas's closet. Grief was still present, but it no longer dictated my posture. It had shifted from wait to witness. On Friday evening, Daniel finally called and asked if he and Olivia could stop by to talk. His tone was measured, but I recognized the undercurrent. They arrived together, standing side by side on the porch as if presenting a unified front. I invited them in and led them to the dining room table where so many important decisions had been made over the years. Olivia began speaking first, her voice composed but tighter than usual. "We heard from a mutual friend that you established a foundation in Dad's name," she said. "That is correct," I replied. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You did not mention that to us. There are many decisions your father and I made over the years that did not require prior approval," I answered calmly. "This one follows the same principle." Olivia's expression flickered, not anger exactly, but recalibration. "Does this change affect the overall estate plan?" she asked carefully. "It clarifies it," I said. Daniel's jaw shifted. "In what way?" "In the way that protects intention over assumption." I let the word settle. I explained, without detail but without hesitation, that portions of the portfolio had been allocated to the Whitmore Foundation and that distributions from the remaining assets would be conditional upon alignment with the values Thomas and I established. Daniel asked what alignment meant. "It means respect for boundaries," I said evenly. "It means decisions are not made for me under the guise of convenience." The room grew quiet. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily, each swing marking the distance between expectation and reality. Olivia folded her hands together on the table. "We were only trying to help," she said. "Help is offered. Control is assumed," I replied gently. I did not accuse them of anything specific. I did not raise my voice. I simply reflected the pattern back to them. Daniel finally looked directly at me, truly looked at me for the first time in weeks. "You think we were trying to take advantage of you?" I held his gaze. "I think you underestimated me." That distinction mattered. The conversation did not explode. There were no dramatic gestures, only a gradual understanding that the structure had changed and would not bend backward. After a few more measured exchanges, they stood to leave. At the door, Daniel paused. "You are not planning to sell the house, are you?" I shook my head once. "I will decide what happens to this house. Not fear, not pressure, not convenience. Me." They walked down the porch steps more slowly than usual. I watched from the doorway until their car disappeared at the corner of Maple Avenue. When I closed the door, the house felt steady, almost protective. I ran my hand along the hallway wall, tracing the faint indentations where Daniel's height had been marked year after year in pencil. Growth leaves evidence. So does strength. And now, for the first time since Thomas's funeral, I understood that the power in this situation had quietly shifted back where it belonged. Spring arrived gradually, almost cautiously, as if the season itself understood that this house had endured enough change. The maple tree in the backyard was now fully green, its leaves casting soft shadows across the deck Thomas built with his own hands. I began spending my mornings outside with a single cup of coffee, no longer setting out 2 mugs by mistake. Grief had not disappeared, but it had settled into something quieter, something that walked beside me instead of pulling me backward. Daniel called less frequently, and when he did, his tone had shifted. There was less direction in his voice and more listening. Olivia remained polite, though careful. The foundation paperwork was finalized, and the first scholarship announcement was scheduled for the fall. Harold sent confirmation that all amendments had been recorded properly. Structure, clarity, Finality. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel asked if he could come by alone. When he arrived, he did not bring brochures or folders. He stood in the kitchen where this had all begun and looked around as if seeing it clearly for the first time. I did not realize how it sounded, he said quietly. All the planning, all the suggestions. I thought I was being responsible. Responsibility does not override respect, I replied evenly. He nodded slowly. I should have asked more and assumed less. That was the first honest sentence I had heard from him in weeks. We sat at the dining room table, sunlight stretching across the wood between us, and spoke without urgency. I explained that my decisions were not punishment. They were protection. Protection of Thomas's work. Protection of my autonomy. Protection of the principle that age does not erase authority. Daniel listened without interruption. When he finally stood to leave, he paused beside the hallway wall where his childhood height had been marked in pencil year after year. I remember you holding the tape measure steady, he said softly. I smiled faintly. I still do. After he left, I walked through the house once more, not to check locks or review documents, but simply to appreciate it. The fireplace stones, the crown molding, the faint indentation on the third stair. Every corner held evidence of a life built intentionally. I understood then that the real shift had not been legal. It had been internal. They had assumed I would retreat into fragility. Instead, I had stepped forward into clarity. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, no shattered relationships, only a recalibration of boundaries. That evening I sat on the back deck as the sun lowered beyond the tree line, casting long gold streaks across the yard. I felt neither victorious nor bitter. I felt steady. Strength does not always announce itself in loud declarations. Sometimes it is the simple refusal to be repositioned without consent. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to review every document, ask every question, and hold your ground without apology. The house remained mine. The authority remained mine. The future remained mine to determine. And as the light faded and the first evening stars appeared, I realized something even more important. I had not strengthened because they underestimated me. I had strengthened because I chose to remember exactly who I was all along.